The biggest lie you've been sold is that you are supposed to be the creator of your reality. Here's the unfiltered truth. You are not here to construct reality. You are here only to experience it. And until personal ego drops the delusion that it's steering the universe, you're only blocking the life meant for you. It's been known for centuries. It's just that most people aren't aware of it. So today we're tearing down the myth of the creator, not to destroy hope for a better future, but to expose the one thing that brings genuine liberation. We'll uncover why so-called manifestation is just a high-tech ego trap, why breaking this illusion is a critical stage in the evolution of consciousness, and what lies on the other side. Then we'll bring out the heavy weapons, modern science, depth psychology, and a declassified CIA intelligence report, all pointing to one conclusion. Your personal I is not the screenwriter, it's merely the receiver. And finally, staying true to the tradition of real-time practice on this podcast, I'll show what experiencing reality looks like in practice through a raw micro-case study of writing this exact episode. No fluff, no spiritual bypassing. Let's dive in. Let's be honest, we've all fallen down the spiritual rabbit hole at some point. I'll go first to confess my sins. Years ago, I signed up for a month-long online course led by a woman whose marketers aggressively branded her as the Queen of Manifestation. Her Majesty's main homework assignment was simple: set a target goal for the month and manifest it. Meaning waiting for it to appear from a completely unexpected source by the end of the program. The only requirement was to choose something realistic enough that your mind could actually believe it. No launching a rocket to Mars on week 2, keep it grounded. And strictly follow all of Her Majesty's instructions. So I looked at my life and decided, okay universe, show me what you've got. I want to manifest a completely surprise, unexpected $100. Just $100, a modest, respectful request. Not $1 million, not a yacht, just a crisp green Franklin magically falling out of the cosmic sky into my wallet. And let me tell you, I worked for that $100. I was huffing and puffing through every single exercise. I did the visualization work, I aligned my energy, I did extra daily meditations, I was practically sending quantum extortion letters to the universe. To cut a long story short, when the end of the month arrived, my extra $100 was completely non-existent. Zero, nada. Instead, I was fed a few glowing testimonials from other participants who had supposedly succeeded, and was told that if it didn't work for me, I simply hadn't tried hard enough. My vibration was probably off, my faith wobbled, and what I really needed to do was stop giving up and work even harder on my mindset. I'm sure many would recognize themselves in this story because it's a classic script nowadays. But the moral here isn't to point fingers and call the manifestation queen a charlatan. Years later, I realized that the issue with these courses is that they are built on a surface-level observation of reality, completely detached from how the mechanics of consciousness and the ego actually interact. They operate under the illusion that creation is done by the ego, when in truth, reality can only materialize through the ego. And the moment you grasp this distinction, everything falls into place. You finally understand why so-called manifestation keeps failing for you, why it seemed to work for a lucky few, and why the entire industry is stuck chasing an illusion. You'll see exactly how as we dive into the topic. But the absolute brilliance of how consciousness actually operates is that despite not getting this $100, I needed to take that course. The whole point was what happened while I was frantically trying to summon that $100. You see, to access my imaginary money, I had to complete her daily modules. Embedded within them were a few genuinely effective exercises for shadow work, essentially Jungian psychology rebranded for the Instagram era. That's the recurring irony of this entire industry. The elements that actually produce results aren't modern manifestational magic at all. They're basic mechanics of depth psychology, mapped out a century ago, long before anyone attached a sales funnel to human consciousness. In a way, it's not a bad thing that people are introduced to their inner architecture through these courses, but it's important that we don't cultivate magical thinking where traceable laws of the psyche are actually at work. Looking back, I realized something profound. I didn't need that $100, but the ego was so dangled by the carrot of a cosmic gift that it willingly sat down and did the deep, uncomfortable psychological labor I actually needed at that stage of my life. Universe didn't give me $100. It used ego's greed to trick me into healing a piece of my shadow. And this brings us to a crucial realization. Manifestation as a tool to bend reality to your will is an absolute illusion of the ego, a spiritual surrogate. But even this illusion serves an evolutionary purpose if you learn to see it. If you grasp one fundamental truth, that nothing is as it seems and that the mind trapped in the cage of the ego takes everything too literally, you begin to see how even the delusion of manifestation is part of a brilliantly orchestrated play by consciousness, ultimately guiding you toward the exact life you were born to live. To be clear, this neither absolves the so-called manifestors nor turns them into villains. While some may operate on standard business logic, just making money, others in this space might genuinely be unaware of the mechanics we're exploring here. If there's just one thing you take away from this, let it be this. This whole manifestation phase is simply a specific stage in the evolution of consciousness. The ego often has to exhaust all its tools for illusory control before it can finally surrender to consciousness. The key is not to get stuck in it, but to recognize it for what it is and move forward. If you look at the self-help industry, you can actually trace the evolution of the ego's desperation. Stage 1 was crude and physical. Write your affirmations 50 times, stare at the vision board, and try to brute force a Ferrari into your driveway. When that failed, the industry evolved. Stage 2 is where we are now. The illusion of becoming the version of yourself that has what you want. It sounds smarter. It talks about alignment and frequency shift. But make no mistake, it is still the exact same terrified ego, just wearing a more sophisticated spiritual mask. It's still trying to manipulate reality, only now through psychological performance. The real evolutionary leap, next stage, isn't about altering yourself to get something. It happens when the ego completely drops the urge to control or acquire altogether. When the friction of personal desire stops, true creation happens. Consciousness simply manifests into matter in the precise form it was designed to, using the exact architecture and settings of this specific body. And this is where ego's true value and role is revealed. In our previous episodes, we established a foundational truth. Consciousness needs an ego. Pure consciousness is an infinite ocean of potential, gigabytes of raw, unmanifested data. But without an ego, it can't even tie its own shoelaces in 3D reality, let alone order an iced oat milk latte. The problem is that an unhealthy ego, whether it's deficient, playing the victim, or hyperinflated, arrogant, and narcissistic, acts like a thick, dirty curtain that completely blocks out the light of consciousness. And behind that curtain, ego basically hijacks the body and mind consciousness initially created to have a very particular experience. And instead of washing that curtain, pop culture monetized its dysfunction. It took an anxious, hyper-controlling, overworked ego and told it, "Congratulations, you've been promoted from panicking human to co-creator of the cosmos. Here's your vision board." In fact, a healthy ego is currently a very rare endangered species, and consciousness puts a human being through the meat grinder of life's trials for one specific reason: to heal and restore that ego its ultimate tool in the 3D world that mutated because of traumatic experiences, social programming, fear, shame, guilt, and all those myths that keep the mind limited to the bars of ego's cage. And one of the biggest obstacles to that healing is the myth of the creator, the stubborn belief that I am the director or co-director of reality. The real crisis of modern world is that instead of doing the quiet, grounded work of psychological integration, we encourage this delusion, turning genuine spiritual awakening into a commercialized self-deception. So today we're calling time on this self-deception. It's time to look at why you are not the creator or even the co-creator of reality. In fact, until you are under this illusion that you manifest anything, you get in the way of the best possible reality to manifest for you. Because you're not here to create reality, you are here only to experience it. And today we're going to look at this through 3 completely different yet astonishingly aligned lenses: modern science, depth psychology, and, believe it or not, a declassified CIA report conducted by a US Army officer for military intelligence purposes. So let's start dismantling the myth right here, beginning with the favorite toy of every modern manifestation guru, quantum mechanics. People love to drag quantum mechanics into manifestation seminars to sound legitimate, referencing the observer effect or wave-particle duality. You've heard the pitch. Your mind collapses the wave function into $1 million. It sounds scientific because it rests on observation of a physical phenomenon, but misinterpreted because viewed through the lens of a panicked ego. What modern science, including the recent Nobel Prize laureates, reveals is that there are essentially 2 different sets of rules operating at the same time. One is the 3D physical level, bound by linear time, cause and effect, physical effort, and hard limitations. This is the domain where the localized mind and ego operate. The other is the quantum field, where all potentials exist simultaneously in an unmanifested state. This is consciousness itself. In quantum mechanics, a particle exists as a wave of infinite possibilities, a state called quantum superposition, until it interacts with a measurement apparatus, collapsing the wave function into a single localized coordinate. In human psychology, the ego acts as that measurement apparatus. And this is where we have to be precise. Having an ego isn't the problem. The state of that apparatus is everything. Here lies the deepest misconception of the modern spiritual world. The observer is not ego, not a separate I, not a human personality trying to manipulate outcomes. The observer is consciousness itself, witnessing life through a body that merely perceives itself as separate. The collapse of the wave function isn't dictated by an ego. It is decided by consciousness, which uses the body as its instrument for particular experience. And here is the most critical realization. The reality that is supposed to collapse for a specific body is already predetermined by that body's innate hardware and settings. There are really only 2 ways this plays out. Either reality unfolds exactly as designed by consciousness and hardwired into your unique blueprint, or it fails to manifest in 1,000 painful ways because of the ego's interference. Quantum science actually completely dismantles the control-free creator narrative, the illusion of a personal I that engineers reality. The ego cannot create reality. It can only distort it. This is the fundamental difference between a healthy ego and an unhealthy one. Consciousness needs a calibrated container to experience itself in physical form. That is the noble function of a healthy ego. It acts as a clear lens and a steady security guard. It provides the boundaries and structure so infinite consciousness can collapse into a grounded human experience. You are not supposed to know intellectually what consciousness is creating until it's done. Otherwise, it would ruin the entire experience. But you can feel it through the texture of the experience itself as it unfolds. And this experience is designed to be abundant for every human life, because consciousness intends for this form to thrive. When it flows through a calibrated container, everything in life plays out like a top-notch movie, producing a deep fulfillment that no material high or intellectual posturing can touch. A healthy ego doesn't choose what gets expressed. It simply surrenders to being the character it was built to be. It embraces this fundamental uncertainty and lives at peace with it. The friction arises when the ego becomes unhealthy, inflated, or deficient. To an unhealthy ego, open potential is terrifying. It cannot handle uncertainty. So it hijacks spiritual terminology, slaps a filter on it, and twists it into awesome. If I just visualize sitting in a red Ferrari hard enough, my mind will force infinite consciousness to drop one in my driveway. Instead of acting as a clean lens, it becomes a tyrannical dictator. Driven by trauma and survival fears, it tries to force the quantum field to bend to its panic scripts. It has to look like a red Ferrari. I am unsafe unless I dictate the outcome. It's a tiny panicked ego operating on limited data in the 3D field of the mind, trying to sit on the throne and dictate to infinite consciousness how the play should be written. Yet, manifestation gurus took this exact neuropsychological spasm, this anxious urge to force reality into a box, and built their holy grail, the law of attraction. On paper, it sounds harmless. Positive vibes, gratitude journals, visualizing your dream kitchen. But under the hood, it turned into a playground for the ego, built on a complete misunderstanding of one phrase: you attract what you are. Non-dual traditions never meant that you magnetically drag physical objects into your life. Consciousness doesn't attract things because it already is everything. The unmanifested field containing every potential variation of existence. Why then, you'd ask, does manifestation appear to work for a lucky few? For one simple reason: because those individuals happen to be operating close to their innate blueprint. They are using the biological wiring, talents, and capacity that consciousness designed for their specific vessel from the start. Because their channel isn't choked by heavy trauma or friction, life moves through them with relative ease. But because they're doing it unknowingly, intuitively, here's where the trap springs. Some might fall into ultimate trap, genuinely believe they did it. When reality unfolds naturally, the ego steps in and takes full credit. Look at me, I did this. My vision board forced the universe to yield. So they write books and sell masterclasses, which more often than not completely fails for everyone else. Why? Because they are selling a template based on their specific biological settings. They are telling a fish to climb a tree just because they happen to be a bird born with wings. But the majority of students will sit there frantically copy-pasting someone else's timeline, only to create more friction, more disappointment, and more neuropsychological exhaustion. But if the ego hijacks this natural flow to inflate itself, at some point the system will always trigger a recalibration. It usually follows one of these brutal scripts. First, if the ego goes too far, it loses everything in a spectacular self-made crash. Second, a force completely beyond human control hits, like a natural disaster, a sudden catastrophe, instantly destroying the illusion that anyone was manifesting or controlling the narrative. Or third, reality leaves the material world intact, but drops a massive biological or existential crisis right on their lap. A severe illness, burnout, or a profound loss of meaning. It's the intelligence of the system reminding, you are the instrument, not the composer. To understand why manifestation fails on a biological level, let's look at neuroscience and the default mode network, DMN, in your brain. The DMN is the neural network responsible for your internal monologue, your narrative sense of self, your worries, and your obsession with controlling the future. Here is the biological trap. When your DMN is driving the bus, it is physically incapable of generating anything genuinely new. The DMN is an automated system loop replaying old files, past traumas, inherited conditioning, childhood fears, and scarcity scripts. Every life is designed to be inherently abundant. It's social conditioning and traumas that lock us in a state of lack, scarcity, and continuous suffering. But here is the thing, it can only be addressed from within, when you see the actual mechanics for what it is. When you sit on your couch trying to visualize a new future from the ego, you aren't accessing raw potential in the quantum field. You're just taking old data from your past, slapping a shiny new filter on it, and calling it creation. The ego cannot create, because it can only recycle what it already knows. This is why you don't get what you're trying to quote-unquote manifest. When you try to force reality to bend using an overactive default mode network, you trigger what philosopher Alan Watts called the law of reversed effort. The harder you consciously force an outcome from a place of egoic desperation, the more you lock your system into the exact state of lack you are running from. While sitting on a meditation cushion trying to visualize abundance, your underlying neurobiology is broadcasting pure panic. This is the irony of modern manifestation. The ego does collapse reality into what it is, just not what it wishes for. An anxious, hyper-controlling ego can only collapse the quantum field into more lack, more friction, and more dysfunctional loops. Genuine creation isn't something the ego achieves. It is consciousness expressing itself the exact second the ego surrenders its attempt to control the outcome. Ancient traditions knew this for thousands of years. In Taoism, they call it Wu Wei, action through non-action, aligning so seamlessly with the natural flow that you stop forcing outcomes from the ego. In the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna tells Arjuna, "You have a right to your labor, but never to the fruits of your labor." Translation: you are here to act in 3D, not to control the cosmic outcome. And to prove this isn't just quantum theory or ancient Eastern mysticism, let's look at depth psychology and see how Carl Jung mapped out this exact same mechanic. Pop psychology loves to quote Carl Jung, but they conveniently gloss over where his most profound late insights actually came from. In 1944, following a severe heart attack, Jung had a direct structural experience, a profound near-death state that stripped away his theoretical scaffolding, which he documented in his autobiography Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Long before the first satellite photos of our planet were even taken, he described floating high above the Earth, looking down at the blue continent bathed in light, and feeling every layer of his personal identity falling away like old clothes. His degrees, his theories, his achievements, and his past resentments were discarded like a heavy clinging husk. What remained wasn't a void, nor was it a list of desires or goals to manifest. It was pure non-local awareness, what he termed the objective self. There were no goals, no manifestations, no plans, just the raw, undeniable fact of existence. But just as he felt ready to dissolve into his essence, an image of his physician appeared with a silent, unyielding mandate: "You must go back." Re-entering his physical body was excruciating. To Jung, returning to the dense, cramped 3D world felt like being locked back inside a tight prison cell. He didn't return with a vision board or a strategy to manipulate outcomes. He returned with a radical empirical realization. The personal ego is not the author of reality. It is merely a receiver. This experience unlocked an unprecedented period of creative flow, solidifying 3 core pillars of his late work. First, self versus ego. The ego isn't the master of the psyche, it's just a localized receiving station. The true self exists outside time and space. Second, the illusion of control, amor fati. The ego's desperate attempt to force its demands onto the universe is a childish delusion. Real alignment happens when you stop fighting the current and allow the larger script of consciousness to unfold. Third, synchronicity and alchemy. Meaningful coincidences and inner transformation doesn't happen through egoic force, but through the psychological transmutation of ego-led into the gold of consciousness. Academic circles often brush this period off as mystical, but to Jung it was raw empirical data. It proved that true transformation never happens by inflating the ego. It happens the second the ego surrenders to the vast intelligence behind it. And if you think this sounds like soft New Age woo-woo, let me introduce you to Lieutenant Colonel Wayne McDonnell, a US Army intelligence officer writing a classified report for military intelligence during the Cold War. You would think that a particle accelerator, Carl Jung's diary, and American intelligence archives belong in three totally different universes. What could possibly be the common denominator between quantum physics, subjective depth psychology, and the cold pragmatism of CIA? I mean, seriously, is there anything on this planet more cynical and grounded than military intelligence? They aren't looking for enlightenment, they are looking for an operational edge. Yet, all three converge on one undeniable truth. The ego is not the director of reality, it is merely a localized receiver. And every time the ego tries to hypercontrol or manifest reality from a state of anxious lack, it literally jams its own frequency. Which brings us to the late 1970s and 80s. At that time, US military intelligence got interested in hemisync, a brainwave technology developed by the Monroe Institute that used binaural beats to synchronize the brain's hemispheres. The military didn't treat this as pseudoscience. They approached it through the cold lens of theoretical physics, neurobiology, and information theory. In 1983, nearly 4 decades after Jung's experience, Lieutenant Colonel Wayne McDonnell, a US Army intelligence officer, authored an extraordinary analysis titled The Gateway Process. You might actually have heard about this document because the internet lost its mind over it at some point. But regardless of whether you've seen it circulating online or not, pay close attention, because mainstream influencers completely missed the point. McDonnell's conclusions were radical. First, reality is a hologram. Physical matter isn't made of solid bricks. It consists of dense energy grids vibrating at specific frequencies. The universe is fundamentally an infinite holographic matrix of consciousness, and the physical world is its projection. Second, you are a fractal. Human consciousness isn't a byproduct of the brain. It's a localized focus of this universal consciousness. The brain isn't a generator of thought. It's a holographic receiver tuned into the quantum field. And third, hemispheric synchronization leads to transcendental experience. When the analytical, ego-driven left hemisphere and the intuitive right hemisphere sync up, the noisy static of the self drops, allowing consciousness to transcend local space-time constraints. In short, the report provided a rigorous scientific framework explaining exactly what Jung experienced empirically in 1944. When the ego quietens down and the default mode network goes offline, reality stops being filtered through the small box of personal identity. The military didn't care about mystical states, they cared about electrical brain output. They mapped how binaural beats guide the brain out of hyperanalytical beta frequencies, where the anxious ego operates, down into deep theta states. In theta, the brainwave chatter collapses and the receiver finally unplugs from the static of personal identity. We'll dive deeper into this specific mechanism in the next episode. The report was later passed to the CIA and eventually declassified. Naturally spiritual influencers sprinted to TikTok shouting, "See, the CIA proved I'm God. Let me show you how to manifest a Ferrari with my third eye." But they clearly didn't read past page 5, because the report's thesis says the exact opposite. You are an interface, not the CEO. You are a fractal of consciousness. The ego, the personal identity, is merely a local receiving station, not the architect. Control must surrender. The gateway process only works when the ego shuts up. To access raw potential, you have to lower the static of the analytical mind and step into the quiet space between thoughts. You cannot force anything, you can only tune. You don't attract reality through forceful mental demands. You align your receiver so the field can express itself without friction. The entire premise of the report was that accessing the consciousness requires absolute stillness. And there's a hilarious twist to this entire CIA saga. When the document was released, page 25 was completely missing, just gone. For 2 decades, the internet went wild. Everyone assumed page 25 held the dark magic, the classified military blueprint for manifesting infinite wealth and bending reality to your personal will. Then 2021 rolls around, the CIA finally drops page 25, and the joke is on everyone. There was no secret hack. McDonald just used that page to break down how consciousness is the ultimate source material and how trying to manipulate it from an anxious, control-obsessed ego is a complete delusion. The CIA document didn't prove that separate ego is the CEO of reality. It proved that the receiver only works when the ego stops jamming the signal. In other words, God mode doesn't activate when the ego takes control. It activates only when the ego completely surrenders to consciousness. So, 3 entirely different disciplines. One single, undeniable conclusion. You are not here to force the script, you are here to receive it. Neuroscience and quantum physics show us the exact biological mechanism, how an overactive default mode network creates the friction of the law of reversed effort, forcibly collapsing infinite potentials into narrow scenarios of scarcity. Carl Jung gives us the lived empirical reality, showing how his near-death experience stripped away his earthly identity like a dry husk, revealing that true creation belongs to the non-local self, not the ego. And the CIA's 1983 gateway analysis provides the cold mathematical calculation, proving that the universe functions as a holographic matrix of consciousness, and your brain can only access its potential when the analytical chatter of the ego completely shuts up. This brings us to the ultimate terrifying for the ego and deeply liberating realization. You create nothing. You are only experiencing. In our episode on the myth of the future self, we talked about the toxic culture of endless self-optimization, treating your personality like a software update that never finishes downloading. But your job in this life is not to become somebody, construct a grand persona, or force your way into destiny that belongs to someone else. The job of the I living in your body right now is simply to become a clear instrument through which consciousness can express itself unimpeded. Which brings us straight back to the promise I made at the start, to show what experiencing reality actually looks like in practice, using the creation of this very episode as a micro case study. Initially, it took me almost a week to draft the first script. That week was brutally hot, with temperatures reaching 37 degrees Celsius, nearly 100 degrees Fahrenheit. With no air conditioning, writing was grueling and recording was even worse. It felt like trying to record a podcast inside a sauna. And yet, despite all that effort, the moment I finished recording, an unexplained impulse washed over me. I took the phone and deleted everything. Nearly an hour of raw footage. Days of work, gone in a single click. I felt completely frustrated, unable to explain why I had just sabotaged my own effort. Deleting that file forced a period of deep observation. Later that day, a video by a behavioral expert appeared in my YouTube feed, talking about the importance of observing unconscious patterns in others without judgment. In that exact second, everything clicked. A sudden realization hit me. The first draft of this episode was packed with judgmental, passive-aggressive shots at manifestation gurus. Very refined and intellectual, but disguised hostility nonetheless. Judgment is the ego's classic mechanism of projecting pain. Pain projected is pain unexamined. Fueled by egoic energy, I was completely blind to it during both the writing and recording processes. But then I suddenly saw clearly hidden layers of resentment and envy within the psyche. At first I was genuinely shocked. Wait, what? Envy? Where did that come from? But when you think about it, given my circumstances, it makes complete sense. Yet it had remained entirely unexamined until now. Let's be clear, the synthesis I'm sharing here is rare. Not because I'm special, but because of how it's created. It isn't compiled from external textbooks. Its source is direct experience. This knowledge is generated from the inside out, rather than from outside in. I received the realization first, then map it through mystical teachings, science, psychology, and philosophy. For most of the content you find nowadays, it's actually the other way around. And yet, for a very long time, I've been doing this while body lives in continuous suffering and mind in permanent terror. Living in a country at war, under constant shelling, enduring winters with no heat or electricity and summers with no water, drowning in debt, lacking money for basic biological survival, with zero external support. Except for my sister, the only person left from my past life who is navigating her own challenges on the path of awakening herself. When basic survival needs go unmet for a long time, it takes a heavy toll on the body and mind. It creates physical pain and mental anger. Anger is always an unfulfilled desire. Unmet needs breed anger. Anger breeds resentment. Resentment breeds envy. And being continuously exposed to the self-help industry, watching figures selling at best 1/10 of the depth I share, becoming millionaires, praised and idolized, only amplifies that pressure. And then a wounded ego projected that unexamined envy onto the page in the form of judgmental, passive-aggressive shots. But the purpose of the ego is simply to be a clear instrument through which consciousness expresses itself. And when you dissect it like this, the breathtaking choreography of life suddenly becomes obvious. This entire ordeal was organized to calibrate the receiver for consciousness. My unexamined resentment was creating static, structural distortions leaking into the script of the podcast. The ego was acting as a smudged lens, bending the truth to serve its wounds. Consciousness didn't block the ego from writing or filming, because the only way to clean a lens is to first make the dirt visible. So life let me run the full script, hit the wall and feel the impulse to delete the footage. Not to punish me, but to burn away the distortion so the raw signal could pass through. And getting through this required to completely surrender to the experience, uncomfortable and frustrating at times. That is what experiencing reality actually looks like. It's not about forcing what the ego wants. It's about absorbing what appears in your field and surrendering to the calibration in real time. Surrendering control to inhabit that experience is the true definition of ego death. It isn't the destruction of who you are, it's the quiet collapse of the illusion that you were ever the author. Awakening doesn't mean emotional numbness. Emotions arise constantly, both quote-unquote positive and negative. Awakening is about disidentifying from them. It's the ability to see them arising and realize clearly. This isn't I am an angry, resentful, or jealous person. It's simply the body and psyche processing these states in response to a specific experience. This is the observer position. Consciousness itself entirely untouched by the fluctuations of the body and mind. Awakening doesn't prevent these states from arising. It simply turns on the lights, making them visible. Crucially, this isn't about dodging agency or escaping responsibility. It's the exact opposite. By removing the blindness of automatic reactions, this identification gives you real choice. It allows you to respond consciously rather than react blindly, taking full ownership of your actions without being driven by unconscious thoughts and emotions. Spiritual growth isn't about acquiring higher states. It's simply cleaning the lens, dropping the panic, and getting out of the way. You don't need to be fully healed or living a perfect life to wake up to this. Body suffering and mind panic can exist, but consciousness remains untouched as a neutral platform underneath them. Awakening isn't an I getting better. It's consciousness stepping back to illuminate the unhealed mechanics of the human vehicle. As Carl Jung famously said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Which brings us directly to the next inevitable existential questions. And if I am not manifesting anything, how do all the creations appear? How do actual breakthroughs happen? How do masterpieces get painted? How do revolutionary scientific equations or iconic tracks get created? And if the ego isn't driving the bus, if everything is already structured by consciousness, am I just a robot stuck on a fixed track of fate? Or do I actually have a choice? The short answer, yes, you do have a choice, but not in the way you think. And that is exactly what we're going to unpack in the next episode. Until then, stop jamming the frequency, release the wheel, and let the receiver do its job. See you next week. We were handed this attractive fairy tale about endless personal choice. But if you strip away the surface level positive thinking and look at how nature actually operates, a completely different picture emerges. Let's look at the neuroscience behind this because it is fascinating. Think, damn it, think! The personal ego possesses only one true freedom, but inside the single freedom lies 100% of your human power.